Why in the world did Congress make it possible for the federal government to shut down? I mean, if you can't reach a new agreement on spending for the government, does it really make sense for everything to just stop? No, of course not. Congress did not create shutdowns. The Jimmy Carter administration created them unilaterally. There were a couple of memos in 1980 from Carter's Attorney General, Benjamin Civiletti, saying that under the Anti-Deficiency Act, if there were not new appropriations, then a number of functions could not go on. Now, there is some historical precedent for this idea. Dating back to 1870, Congress passed legislation saying that the executive branch couldn't just spend without Congress's approval. What had happened is during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's administration would spend all the money that Congress gave it to fight the war really fast, and then come back to Congress and be like, hey, we can't fight the war unless you give us a lot more money. That's called a coercive deficiency, and Congress didn't like it. They wanted to be in charge of the power of the purse, like the Constitution gives them. So, in 1884, they passed the foundation of the modern statute. It prohibited the agencies from spending too fast and set up a process so it had to be parsed out over the entire fiscal year. So Congress updated this law in 1950 in a big way. They still didn't create shutdowns. The Jimmy Carter administration committed essentially a presidential power grab in 1980, and they set a distinction between what are called essential services and non-essential services. Essential mean they're necessary for national security, they're necessary to protect human life, and they're necessary for overall safety. Now, some things are important to all of those things, but aren't operating on a day-to-day basis. Most of those things were declared non-essential, and those employees are sent home, they're furloughed, and whether they get their pay or not from the time that they're not working used to be up to Congress, but Congress actually passed a law in 2019 guaranteeing back pay for federal employees who are furloughed, so that's no longer an issue. But what the Carter administration effectively did was they sabotaged the new budget process that Congress had enacted in 1974, pushed it through even though Nixon was not a big fan of it, and this was essentially the administration striking back in a way against Congress's attempt to reclaim its powers. And over time, what we've seen is that congressional leadership of both parties have found that it is easiest to have a deadline, especially against a holiday, so they can get most members to vote for a giant omnibus package that was negotiated behind closed doors, where most members are actually voting for it only because it's better than a shutdown, not because they like what's in there. Heck, they don't even know what's in there for the most part, because they haven't had time to read it between when the bill is released to them and when they have to vote on it. So this has also led to shutdowns. There are costs associated with that. There's a lot of economic activity that gets pushed from, obviously, during the shutdown to sometime afterwards, but there are other things that are just gone. Total waste, total loss to the economy, things like permits. If you are trying to get a permit to build something, well, you can't go back in time and hire the people to do the thing that you wanted to do. Sometimes research has shut down, or research that should have been renewed hasn't been able to restart, and so the labs all have to be started again from scratch, and that's a real problem with some of these things that take months or even years to play out. In 2013, we had a long shutdown. This was when Senator Ted Cruz led the attempt to get Republicans to unite behind defunding the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. I was a congressional staffer at the time. I was the budget staffer for the member that I worked for, and I got furloughed because they decided it was more of a political decision than a budget decision. I understand that, but it was a silly situation. Obamacare still hasn't been defunded. It's still the law of the land for the most part. And so the attempt to use the shutdown for leverage, it didn't work. In 2018, President Trump wanted to build the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, and he was holding out trying to get Congress to approve it. So he was threatening to veto and then also pushing Republicans in Congress to say no to the appropriations legislation if it didn't have funding for the border wall. 35-day shutdown went into 2019 from the one Congress into the next Congress, where power actually flipped in the House from Republicans to Democrats. At the end of the day, Congress didn't approve the funding for the border wall. President Trump did find another way to get the financing for it, but it wasn't a very healthy process, and it led to a lot of polarization. Now, going into 2025, or even this year, the fiscal year ends on September 30th, 2024. It's possible there's a shutdown, probably not right before the election, but they will do some sort of a continuing resolution to extend current funding into December or sometime next year, and there could absolutely be a shutdown then, unless Congress fixes it. Now, we mentioned that President Trump wasn't able to use his leverage to get the border wall funding. We mentioned that Senator Ted Cruz wasn't able to use government funding as leverage to defund Obamacare. Well, President Obama was still the president of the United States. And the reality is that there is no leverage for the holdouts. The leverage always belongs to those writing the bills, and those writing the bills are the Appropriations Committee members, especially the most senior Appropriations Committee members. And because it's a closed group, a small group, it gives the president outsized influence in setting forth that deal. Now, shutdowns are bad. The waste and the undermining of democracy that comes with these bloated omnibus bills right before a holiday deadline, that's even worse. And ultimately, Congress is going to have to fix this. In theory, a new administration could be like, actually, the Carter administration was wrong, let's fix that. But they're not going to, because shutdowns give presidents so much power in the budget process, much more than is appropriate. Congress is supposed to be writing the bills. Congress is supposed to be setting policy. Yes, the president can veto, but the current situation gives the president way more power than he's supposed to have. It would actually be really good for Congress to do this, by the way, because right now, the process empowers only a handful of members to write the legislation. Most members are shut out of it. So the way to fix it is with legislation like the Prevent Government Shutdowns Act. This has two pieces. First of all, members of Congress are stuck in D.C. trying to finish up appropriations if they don't get it done by the start of the new fiscal year. There are a number of rich members of Congress, not all of them, but enough of them. So if you threaten to withhold their congressional salary, so that's a little less than $200,000 a year, if you're worth hundreds of millions, it doesn't matter to you if your salary gets withheld. In fact, there are some members who have tried to capitalize on the political dynamics of saying that their salary should be withheld if there's a shutdown that aren't rich. So that kind of backfires, but where members are all equal is time. If they're stuck in a room, or Congress, the Capitol, together, trying to figure out how to fix this stuff, they will eventually figure out how to do it. So that's piece one. They're all stuck here until they figure out how to fix it. Secondly, there's no shutdown. The spending just continues on at the current level that was most recently approved. Now, there are different proposals out there that try to increase the amount of spending. Those tend to come from Democrats. And then there's other proposals that would reduce spending every so often. Those tend to come from Republicans. The political sweet spot for what are called automatic continuing appropriations seems to be flat funding. Current funding that we're on until we sort it out. And the requirement to stay in D.C. until they figure it out would really light a fire under them to get it done so that they can move on to other things that they care about doing as well. Now, this legislation, the Prevent Government Shutdowns Act, it is bipartisan and bicameral, which means it's in both houses. In the Senate, there are 18 Republicans, led by Senator James Lankford from Oklahoma, and there are 4 Democrats, led by Maggie Hassan, a Democrat from New Hampshire. There was actually a test vote on this language to a minibus appropriations package last year in late 2023. That vote that Mr. Lankford offered got 47 out of the 48 Republicans who were voting to vote for it, and then 9 of the 50 Democrats who were voting voted for it. But what was interesting about that is that Senator Patty Murray, a Democrat from Washington, she's the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, she pushed really hard for her colleagues to vote against it. And so there were even some supporters of this legislation or other legislation that voted against it because they would be voting on something that wouldn't have a clear path to being enacted. In a different format, there is a lot more support among both Republicans and Democrats Democrats for fixing this problem, but it has to be done the right way to work politically for them within the institution. In the House, there are 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. It's led by Republican Jody Arrington from West Texas. He is the chair of the House Budget Committee, and Democrat Jimmy Panetta, a member of the House Budget Committee from California. Now, that's a smaller number, 8 out of 435 versus 22 out of 100 in the Senate. But what's interesting is that Representative Don Beyer from Arlington and Alexandria, Virginia, has introduced similar legislation that doesn't have the requirement to stay in town. It's just the flat funding continues until Congress passes the new legislation that replaces that. But there are 22 Democrats on that legislation, including Mr. Beyer, and most of them are progressives. So when you add up the progressives, more moderate bipartisan Democrats and Republicans, as well as some other Republicans, you actually have an incredibly broad coalition of support for this legislation. Now, it would be a game changer to do this. As I said, most members of Congress will vote for the Omnibus Appropriations Act, not because they like it, they don't know what's in it, they haven't had time to digest it, but just because it's better than a shutdown. It doesn't have to be better than current policy necessarily. Oh, and by the way, the y-axis, the up and down, that is the axis of good policy. It's not necessarily higher spending. But now, with an automatic continuing appropriations requirement in place, shutdowns are off the table. So if you want to get the votes for the new legislation, the new appropriations, it actually has to be better than current policy. And that's in the subjective opinion of members of Congress. But to get their votes, you're going to have to be a little more bottom up, be more inclusive, get their ideas, get them bought in, get them skin in the game in order for them to want to vote for the thing. People don't like to vote for stuff if they haven't had a chance to have their ideas heard, at least, even if their ideas weren't adopted. So there are many reasons to do fresh appropriations. Sometimes people will say, oh, well, if we did automatic continuing appropriations, Congress would never do appropriations again. That is silly. So flat funding doesn't account for improvements in productivity. It doesn't account for inflation or population growth. But even beyond that, there are lots of policy reasons to do this. The world is changing constantly. There's a real need to update our foreign policy and especially our national defense spending allocations. That's a really important part of appropriations. It's about half of appropriations, and we need to be able to have Congress adjusting that for changes in the world. This would shift the power of the purse toward Congress. You would have to get members of Congress bought in. The way you do that is by incorporating their ideas. The way ideas get incorporated into legislation, sometimes that is at the committee stage, in the Appropriations Committee, and sometimes that's on the floor. So if you have an amendment that the administration doesn't like, but it's the administration plus the 4 Republican, Democrat, House, Senate leaders of the Appropriations Committee, the administration can often get its way. But if you have an open vote on the floor of the House, and 400 members out of the 435 vote for it, then it's pretty much impossible for the administration to be like, no, we don't like it. Congress is going to get its way much more of the time. There is some experience that we've seen in the states. Wisconsin and Rhode Island have been doing something like this for generations, and they're not always perfectly on time, but they're pretty close and actually a lot better than Congress in terms of wrapping up their budget cycle. North Carolina just adopted it in 2016. They knew they were going to be going into a period where they'd have divided control between a supermajority Republican legislature, or at least a majority Republican legislature, and a progressive Democratic governor, potentially. And the way that they set it up, they have automatic continuing appropriations at flat funding that makes it so that they do eventually come to an agreement, but in the meantime, they're not imposing that political drama on the citizens or the residents of their states. So it's a good thing to do. There's really no good reason why not to do. Some people will talk about defense, but the reality is the problems that the Department of Defense has with continuing resolutions, first of all, it stems from them being the ad hoc, variable timing continuing resolutions, but also there are 3 provisions in the Defense Appropriations Act that make it really difficult for DoD to operate under those circumstances. Congress could certainly remove them from the Defense Appropriations Act or weaken them, as they have done a little bit of so far. So what President Carter's administration broke, Congress can fix. It's important to do this to get Congress back in charge of setting policy making, to get Congress to be more bottom-up, more inclusive, more driving the policy agenda, and less deferential to the president, whose main job is supposed to be executing the laws that Congress passes. In other words, it is time to end government shutdowns for good. Thanks for joining. Please like and subscribe.